Welcome to Economy Made Simple. I am Shamubeel Eaqub, the Chief Economist at Simplicity. There's a lot going on in the world right now, and I'm here to make sense of it. Brought to you by Simplicity, New Zealand's non-profit KiwiSaver and fund manager, who are on a mission to make Kiwis richer and smarter with money. This episode, I'm joined by my colleague Liv. We're going to talk about why it's so hard for politics to make sense. Hi, Liv.
Hi, Shamubeel. Thanks for having me on. It's nice to be on someone else's podcast rather than my own.
It's going to be fun.
Yes, hopefully.
So today we want to talk about social cohesion.
Yes, a topic that you know a lot more about than me. So let's crack in. Can you explain to me and our audience a little bit better around what social cohesion really means?
Yeah, I think social cohesion's best understood when we don't have it. So the opposite of social cohesion is polarization. So when we see Trump, Brexit, the rise of the far right, that's when communities have become so polarized, they can't seem to find a way forward. And so social cohesion is essentially the glue that holds us together, that lets us still be different, but still have a way to work together.
So it's not thinking all the same, right?
Absolutely not. I think the beauty of any society is that we have diversity of views and experiences, but we still need to come together when there are big decisions to be made. Things like retirement policy or whether we pay back debt after a crisis, because quite often when we make decisions, there'll be winners and losers. And how do we make sure that those people who have to bear the cost can do so and want to do so?
So do you think that kind of means thinking the same politically, like slightly right or slightly left?
I don't think so. Again, the diversity of political views is really healthy because what we want to do is we want to have a really good debate about what the issues are, and then we want to have a debate about what the best answers are. And quite often politics is about being able to have the debate in a way that's organized, but at the same time, we still want to reach a solution that's acceptable to the majority of New Zealanders. When we're unable to do that, that's when we've become polarized and we move into this back and forth types of politics. One party does something, another party undoes it.
Yes, in those short 3 years that we have, right? Especially when you've got two sides of the fence spending the first couple of years undoing each other's decisions. That doesn't seem efficient or effective.
It's not. And so when we see politics that's doing and undoing all the time, whenever there's a change of government, what we're seeing is a society that's becoming less cohesive.
Oh, I like it. You brought it back there. Nice.
Well, it is us becoming more polarized. So if you're on the red team, you do this. If you're on the blue team, you do this. I think there are a lot of things that New Zealanders can agree on that are just good for New Zealand, regardless of which political party you support.
And that could lead to more, I guess, bipartisan policies coming into effect, right? Rather than just red versus blue.
Absolutely. And there are lots of things New Zealand's actually done a really good job of doing bipartisan policy. So whether it's around things like KiwiSaver, around things like foreign policy, we've had cross-party support in terms of how to do it. Of course, there's friction at the fringes, but that's healthy. But the core of it has been very strongly supported across the political spectrum.
For now. So that leads me into my next question. Why do you think social cohesion is so relevant with regards to what's going on in the world right now?
Well, when I look at what's going on in the US, the answer to that is not because of Trump. It's because there is polarization in the US society. So let me explain. Over the course of the last 30 years, inequality within the US has not improved. In fact, poverty has increased in many places, and that has spilled over into political polarization because people have lost trust in the economy, trust in each other, trust in institutions. And that spills over to this desire to do something different and unorthodox and harsh. Even if I can't get ahead, I want to get those other people.
I want to make America great again.
Absolutely. Even if it hurts me, I'm willing to bear the cost because I feel so aggrieved by my experiences and lack of progress and lack of hope. So social cohesion, in my view, is the bit that underpins why we've got the kinds of unorthodox policies that we're seeing around the world, particularly with the tariffs in the US right now, but also Brexit in the UK, the rise of the far right across Europe. So these are not isolated things. I think there is something broader going on across Western democracies around the world where we're finding something has happened to the social fabric that is now spilling over into the politics.
So do you think that inequality in general is just getting worse across the world, or what's going on?
Generally speaking, we've seen enormous progress around the world in the last 100 years. So abject poverty has reduced significantly. But within countries, so particularly in advanced economies, we've seen almost no progress in inequality. including in New Zealand, where since the 1990s, we haven't really made progress. So what we're seeing now is that, yes, there's kind of this generalized improvement in global conditions, the improvement in the average, but there's a group of people who don't feel like they're getting ahead. And in fact, that is their experience. And they're the ones who feel aggrieved, and I think their grievances are real.
Right. So you're saying that the general world poverty is going down, but potentially within each country, there's being a little bit more of a divide between the haves and the have-nots?
Absolutely. So what we're seeing, I think, is two things. One is that inequality is quite entrenched, and in some places it's increasing, but also the experience of poverty is getting more intense. So we're seeing that in New Zealand as well. So at the latest count, we probably think a quarter of New Zealanders go hungry some of the time because they don't have enough money.
And how does that compare to old days? Is it getting worse?
It is exceptionally high. So in Australia, it's half that amount.
And how is that going to look in New Zealand as, I guess, social cohesion is almost the opposite of inequality, right? Like you've got social cohesion versus inequality.
Income inequality is just one of those divisions that shows that our society has become fractured, that the experience of being a New Zealander or being in that country is different depending on your economic situation, where you might live, what suburb you live, what kind of friends you have. So it's this thing about we become very fractured in our identity and experience of our nation.
So you know that in the third world countries like Brazil, India, Venezuela, there's this really strong divide between the haves and haves not, or the rich and poor. Do you think that's where we're headed?
I don't think we're headed quite to that kind of extremes, because we still have a very strong welfare safety net, even though it's not generous enough and it's quite grudging. The reality is that we still have a safety net that ensures that we don't have the kind of really terrible poverty that we see around the world. Right. So that's a good thing. But what we're finding in the data is that it's getting very difficult to escape the poverty trap. And that makes it feel like it's a hopeless situation, that you're stuck.
And as you've said, there's more people, there's a higher and higher proportion getting into that can't always put food on the table type of situation, right?
That's right. It's the expansion of poverty that worries me. But also it's true that when you're very rich, you don't have empathy for those people who are very poor, because you don't understand what that experience of poverty is like. And when we ask people, are welfare payments in New Zealand generous enough? Poor people will inevitably say no, and rich people will say absolutely.
We've talked about this. It's one of those hard questions to look at and see the different answers from rich versus poor, right?
It is, but it's also that lack of lived experience, right? Very few of us can experience living on less than $30,000 a year, but many people in New Zealand do. And how can you think that when you couldn't live on that kind of money, that it's fair for somebody else to live on that?
I think there's this whole just get off the dole and work, but it's really never as simple as that, is it?
No, and look, a lot of poverty in New Zealand is not people who are necessarily on welfare. A lot of poverty in New Zealand are the working poor. These are people working multiple jobs on really low incomes, and they're working really hard to get ahead, but they can't. And I've had this conversation recently when somebody say, I wasn't always rich. I got rich because I worked hard. And it's that thing, that hard work gives you a better life, is a really fundamental thing that we've told ourselves as a national identity, except it's not true for so many people.
Yes.
And so when the national identity, the promise of what New Zealand can give you, when that is no longer true in people's lived experiences, people lose trust in that view. People lose trust in the institutions and how things work. And that contributes to that slow erosion of trust and social cohesion.
And in terms of that erosion, what does that look like in terms of impacting the wider economy, like the climate, the international economy, trade, politics, all of that?
Yeah, so the reason why social cohesion matters is because we're able to deal with these big issues around climate change, the big decisions we have to make around aging population. There will be winners and losers when we make policy decisions. And if we're not a cohesive society, the losers will not allow those decisions to stand. So for example, when it comes to changing retirement age or contributions, or maybe even thinking about making New Zealand Super means tested, making KiwiSaver compulsory, you'll see this visceral reaction. No, it couldn't possibly be. I'm owed this thing.
I paid my taxes.
Even though that's not true, because we've never paid taxes for our future selves. So the challenge with this stuff is, unless we're a cohesive society, it's very hard to say, yes, there is a cost, but as a result of this, future generations will be better off, because these are decisions that need to be made. if we don't make those decisions today, we're asking our children and grandchildren to make even tougher decisions.
Or bear the brunt of our poor decisions, right?
Absolutely. But social cohesion is the necessary ingredient for those difficult decisions that are ultimately the right decisions.
Yeah, is understanding other people's lived experiences and understanding the greater good versus compromise. And if you can't look outside your own situation, that makes social cohesion very, very hard, right?
Absolutely. Social cohesion is almost their self-awareness to go, I benefited from the decisions of past generations, and I will make some decisions that might cost me now, but I will leave the world better for my future generations, or for other people in my community who need my help, whom I might not know personally, but I have empathy for them because we're part of this greater collective. It's always about reaching compromises in ways that are enduring so that we can have a better outcome for most people.
I think a really good example of this is tax, when you pay higher tax than your neighbour. And we recently did a podcast episode explaining tax and KiwiSaver, and part of it was you don't need to hate tax or resent tax. If you have to pay more tax, that likely means that you can actually afford to pay more tax, because even after tax, you're making a lot more money than the person paying less tax, right?
Absolutely. And those communal things that we enjoy, the schools, the hospitals, the police force, the security, the parks, all those kinds of things, they're only possible because of the collective contribution we make through tax. Tax is not the cost, but it's the price of the goods and services that we want in the public realm. Tax is a really powerful thing, but because it can be quite easily hijacked by, it's theft, it's imposition.
My money.
It is, but we don't live our lives and our economies don't exist in a vacuum. Economies are about people, and it's the connection between people that allows good things to happen.
If you feel resentful and separate from others, it's harder to think of that socially cohesive greater good, right?
It is, and I think then you go, because those people are not my responsibility, I should look after myself first. But of course, the way that public policy works and how good society works is if you take care of society first, you will be taken care of as an individual most of the time. But social cohesion is absolutely necessary ingredient for a well-working community and economy.
So how does inequality, so when people feel excluded from the benefits of society or feel different from each other, how does that impact trust in institutions and government and the system?
So what you see is that when there are people who are experiencing financial discomfort, when they're feeling like there is no way to make progress by working hard, their sense of self-worth erodes. Their connection with their community reduces. Their participation in community and political processes reduces, and they have less trust in politics, politicians, political processes. It just escalates across every facet of somebody's life because they feel like this whole setup doesn't work for me. And at work in social cohesion, what we found was the most divisive element of society was poverty and inequality. The more the difference of financial experiences, the more it was likely to explain why you felt disconnected.
Having the rich get richer and the poor get poorer, which is, as the saying goes, right? That is a really big issue to try and tackle.
Absolutely. The reason why I want to really tackle this issue of social cohesion is it's at the heart of how we're able to make those hard decisions. And New Zealand is at a crossroads where we will have to make some big decisions around the geopolitics, or whether it's around aging population, whether it's around climate change. These are big things that will have big costs, but also the big benefits if we act in the right way and in an enduring way. And that's why social cohesion is so important, to make that process better and those decisions that endure over time. I'm really worried that we're in a position today where we're not able to make those kinds of decisions because our society, it's becoming more fractured.
So you recently did a study around Australia versus New Zealand, right?
Yeah, look, when we compared New Zealand with Australia, essentially what we found is in New Zealand, we are falling behind on most things. But the kinds of things that really worried me were things like only a third of New Zealanders feel financially comfortable. In Australia, it's twice as much.
We have quite a high rate of people that are struggling to put food on the table.
This is it. And so when you've got a quarter of New Zealanders who are saying that I skip meals sometimes or often because I don't have enough money, in Australia it's half that, you kind of go, something's happening in New Zealand. They're not in a particularly good position either. Their social cohesion has been eroding over time, like it has been around Western democracies around the world. And I think the question for me is, how do we make sure we understand that there is something going on? The story we like to tell ourselves that New Zealand is an egalitarian, fair, inclusive society.
It's not true.
The evidence doesn't show that. The evidence shows that actually that's not true. Whether it's around poverty and inequality, whether it's around our political alliances, whether it's around ethnicity or our age. So what I'm seeing is a society that's fractured but not yet polarized. And that's good in that I think we can still see each other's points of view in some areas of life, whereas in places like the US where the politics has become so polarized that if you're a Republican, you must think in this way. If you're a Democrat, you have to think in this way. I don't think that's quite true in New Zealand yet.
Yes, if we can actually make progress to reverse the trend that you're seeing, right?
This is it. And I think I want to be optimistic about New Zealand because we've got so much to protect. And there is a collective view of we belong in this place. That's good. But if the experience every day is saying to you that actually you might think you belong, but you don't actually, that erodes away that trust, that connection. And the way forward from here is not just to kind of go talk about it, but we also have to think about different ways of engaging. I think there is an element of just leadership that's required from our political leaders where they can speak about New Zealand rather than just about their voters.
Yes, so wider rather than catering to your target.
There's a difference between managerialism and leadership. So we need to see some leadership and statesmanship from our political leaders across the political spectrum because their duty lies to all New Zealanders, not only to those people who vote for them. I think it's a big ask, but it's important. And the second part is the political process. We need to have political processes that are just a bit more confrontational at the beginning so that we are able to reach solutions that are broadly agreed amongst community. Why can't we have debates about policies 5 years out? Let's have an all-out debate, discussion, disagreement.
Between parties?
Between parties, between public, everybody. But the things that we do for the next 3 years, at least around those big issues like infrastructure, education, health, let's fight it out. But then the next 3 years is almost apolitical. Just let that stuff happen because those are the agreements we made 5 years ago. So political process is an important one. It's become too executive, too top-heavy. So that broader political system and policy process, I think, needs to move away from only technocrats and politicians driving change to having greater engagement with New Zealanders, because currently New Zealanders are losing connection and trust in the process, the policies, and the policymakers.
And that comes back to that social cohesion.
This is it.
Yeah.
So when it comes to what we can do as individuals, I think there are three things for me. The first is just awareness, just understanding that the story we tell ourselves that New Zealand is this beautiful country and everything is fine is not true. Just admit there is a problem and that's okay. The second thing I think is a really hard one, and I find it very difficult myself, is when you talk to somebody, are you speaking to the stereotype of that person or the individual? Do you see a brown person or a national voter or a Labour voter
Or an old person.
When we speak to people as if they're stereotypes versus seeing the individual and the complexity and the diversity, that makes it very hard for us to empathize with individuals and then, as a result, to empathize with groups of people.
So does that maybe mean listening more? That sounds to me like you're coming into a conversation with A, an agenda, and B, assumptions. And so if you try and leave them at the door, then you'll listen more to what they actually have to say and understand them better?
Absolutely, Liv. And I think that's my third point is when we engage with somebody, how can we make it a positive engagement? When I'm talking to you, Liv, am I trying to convert you to my point of view, or are we simply conversing to understand? We don't always have to agree on everything, but having the conversation, it helps us understand where we're coming from. And more often than not, I think we'll find that we're moving towards each other rather than away from each other. And even if we don't, it doesn't matter because at least we've understood.
Yeah, I like that. I would almost go a step further as to challenge yourself with hey, why don't I let that person convince me of their viewpoint rather than me convince them?
Absolutely. It's that thing about, am I open to changing my mind if the evidence is presented to me? It's really hard to do that because we become very hardened to our viewpoints. But fundamentally, that is the thing that we all have to try and do. Is learn to change your minds if the evidence is compelling enough. I think those two things about not seeing a stereotype and trying to converse might be good first steps towards essentially listening better because you park some of those preconceived ideas, those biases that we all have, but just being aware of them, and it's okay. I don't think New Zealand is irrevocably broken, but also I'd like it to be much better for my children.
Yeah. There's work to do, right?
There is work to do, and I think we should be okay to roll up our sleeves and do this stuff. And so the reason why I did this work on social cohesion was, again, it's around New Zealand has so much to protect and so much to improve. If we work together better, we will be able to do that. But if we don't have social cohesion, we will not be able to make changes that are good and enduring.
Do you think that KiwiSaver has any role to play in leading to better social cohesion?
Absolutely. Retirement policy is going to be one of those big issues that we have to deal with. And inevitably, KiwiSaver will play a significant role in how we make retirement system in New Zealand better. Already, KiwiSaver is a big success. We've gone from something like 20% of New Zealanders saving regularly to now over 60% of households. We know that KiwiSaver is going to play that critical role in essentially helping us smooth the way towards how we make New Zealand's finances and politics more sustainable. How we choose to do it depends on what we do over the coming decade. That window of opportunity is in front of us. I think we need to make sure that KiwiSaver is available to everyone, not just those on high incomes. Mm-hmm. We can do that by making the employer contributions compulsory, for example, and removing the link between employee and employers. I think we need to see contribution rates increase a lot because it's not enough yet to make people comfortable in retirement. The reality is that your income should be similar, a little bit less than what you earned during your working life. So if you're not saving a sufficient portion of your income, it will not get you there. The final thing that's quite close to my heart is I'd love our children to start having a KiwiSaver from when they're born. Every New Zealand child to turn into adulthood with some money to their name. That little bit of financial comfort would make a huge amount of difference. The $1 billion we currently spend on KiwiSaver subsidies could instead be spent on kids.
That's a really interesting one. That type of change requires more social cohesion.
Absolutely.
Because it's taking away from the individual to the future generation. And this is something that I think about because I'm not having kids. And I think that's a good idea. But I think it's an interesting, polarising one to say, take it away from our working life government contributions and saying, give it to the next generation. I think that concept requires good social cohesion and understanding and having empathy.
Absolutely. And that's why we can't make these big policy decisions if New Zealanders are not together in agreeing that this is a good idea. And so KiwiSaver can absolutely play a big role in this, but it's within the wider systems of retirement policy changes in New Zealand, and we have to take New Zealanders along with us. I think right now New Zealand is not cohesive enough for us to be able to do that in a painless way. But we do need to find a way because the sooner we do it, the more sustainable our retirement system will be, even though there'll be some other things we'll have to work on.
Okay, I think that's all the questions I had.
Thanks, Liv. It's great to be able to have this conversation about social cohesion because it's very close to my heart. I really want us to remember that it is not about being the same, but it's about being able to accept each other for what they are and to make those big decisions together.
Awesome. Catch you next time.
Thanks for tuning in. If you enjoyed it, please consider subscribing or sharing with your friends and family. See you next month. Everything we cover in this session is for general information only. We are not tailoring our comments to your financial situation or providing financial advice or recommendations. This information and comments we provide are not intended to convey any guarantees as to the future performance of any investment products, asset classes, or capital markets. Past performance is no guarantee of future performance. Please refer to our full disclosure statement in the description.